This is my day to get acquainted with what looks to be a sort of a middle-aged female revolutionary. And I have a great affection for all the revolutionaries in my life, though I've never really quite managed to be one. And I hope maybe it'll be catching, and maybe she can teach me how to become a little bit more, I don't know. Spectacular is the word. I think you use the word spectacular in your book, Beautiful Trouble, that all peace activists need to be put on spectacles in order to get attention. And for somebody who's come out of the background working with Greenpeace, I could see how you think that way. So anyway, this is Nadine Bloch, and we've just met. So, but I know a little about her because a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed her partner, co-author, Lisa Shirk, and they have both been working together on a project called SNAP, and I'm not quite sure what that is, but she's going to tell us. Hi, Nadine.
Hi, Metta. How are you?
I'm great. All right. So now, hold up that book first thing, and let's get right into work talking about SNAP.
Well, if you're talking about SNAP, it's backwards, right? Synergizing Nonviolent Action and Peace Building. So I don't know how much you talked to Lisa about it, but we are co-editors of what we're calling an action guide. It's full of information and a lot of strategic planning pieces and methodologies, looking at the benefits of both synergizing, of taking the whole field of nonviolent action and the field of peace building and looking at what they have to offer each other to help.
That is exactly what Shaska Byerly told me about you and why I should talk to you. Because I have often been hung up on the polarization, you might say, between the kinds of work that go into mediation, conflict resolution, helping people be nice to each other, and peace in the sense of, harmony, versus justice and protest and all of the actions that go with demanding social change. So those things have often seemed to me to be contradictory. And it was Shaska Byerly who told me that I ought to talk to you people because you've got a way of putting it together. So here's your chance. Explain to me how we can be both revolutionaries and peaceable, what's the word for it? Peace builders. We want something softer and sweeter. I actually yesterday interviewed another person who is a former colonel in the Canadian Armed Forces, definitely 33 years in the military, but he's the softest, peacemaker you can ask for, really talking about, empathy and making sure your heart is clear before you try peace action and all of these spiritual things. So here we go. Tell us what your book is about.
Right. So first of all, let's talk about it. It's really not it's a book in the sense that it's a lot of pages, but it's not a book in the sense that you're going to leave it on your shelf and ignore it. It's really a guide, in particular for practitioners or facilitators or trainers of nonviolent action or peace building. So this guide, I'll just use the word guide, really came about because we have been looking at what makes campaigns effective, what makes social justice, social change campaigns effective. And a lot of the what you call polarization or seemingly contradictory approaches from official peace building and official nonviolent resistance movements are in fact just that. They're just seemingly contradictory. When we look at what makes successful movements, what makes campaigns successful, it's integration of skills that you might ordinarily consider just peace building skills or ordinarily consider part of a civil resistance campaign. So often we see traditional, formal peace builders who think that the conclusions will happen at a negotiation table with certain parties involved. They're disparaging towards folks in the street who are making noise and building people power and leveraging the power that comes from working in community. Whereas peace builders often see the failures of formal negotiation and peace building tables because they don't include every stakeholder that needs to be included, because there hasn't been power built up to make sure that that happens. And so what we really need to understand is that campaigns, movements operate on a trajectory of sorts, from a place where there's low awareness generally in the public and a high imbalance of power being used, and often that means that there's a severe injustice in the community or lots of violence. And we have to move our communities and our ecosystems, if you will, from that place to a place of higher awareness throughout the whole community, and a place where power is balanced, so that when you do get to a negotiation table, if that's where you're headed, or you do get to a place where you can regulate and make laws, that your interests are represented in a way that the power structure understands that you too have power and then is willing to negotiate. Mm-hmm. So a lot of this work is based on the understandings that a man named Adam Curl, a Quaker, put into a diagram quite a number of years ago. And this guide, the Synergizing Nonviolent Action Peace Building Guide, is about how we need all of these tools in our toolbox. That early on in nonviolent resistance campaign, you need to learn how to talk to each other and talk to people who think differently, some basic dialogue skills. And later on, you know, as a peace builder, you're going to need to make sure that, you know, you have power to ensure that the people at the negotiation table are representative of all the stakeholders. So it's not an either or situation. It's in fact what we want to do is make sure that we have all of those skills and all of the knowledge and all of the attributes and abilities of that entire spectrum represented, so that our movements can be more effective and more successful.
Okay, well, it sounds good. I mean, who could object to that? Come on and give me some examples, because I think we're on our way to understanding that.
Yeah, so you can, in the front of each of these chapters of the book or the guide, are case studies of what happened in Tunisia, case studies of what happened in the civil rights struggle in the US, case studies of what happened in Liberia, and so forth. So there's lots of examples of successful movements that both had a street game, if you will, and levied or parlayed that into leverage at a negotiation table. And we see there's examples where things have failed as well, when street activists have failed to step into negotiation, thinking that that was a sellout. Egypt is an example. Most recently, Tahrir Square protests. But there's also plenty of examples where people jump right away to formal peace building or negotiation tables without representation of women or youth or minorities, and they have been resounding failures as well. So, you know, through history, there's lots of examples. And this guide, the SNAP guide, is available for free on the U.S. Institutes of Peace website. It just got posted there a few weeks ago, although the book's been done a little while. So I really encourage people who are interested in being more effective campaigners, whether you're on the trajectory at the very beginning part where there's low awareness and a high imbalance of power, or whether you're in a position where you actually do have more or less democratic rule and widespread information and education. It still behooves us as citizens to be active in making sure that our elected officials are going to actually deliver what we want. And, you know, as I like to say, democracy is not a spectator sport.
And people do really interesting things like street demonstrations. You see that as a way of gaining power. At least I think you are. That would be the purpose of it anyway. I see that as the actions of people who don't have power or who think they don't have power. Establishment type peace groups are much more polite and much more actually effective in the sense of being powerful. They probably have more influence on government policy.
Let's just be really clear on that. Lots of people have been brought in to sit at a table, and they're listened to, and they have no power, and they're actually blinded by the fact that they sit at that table. And if they do have any power, it's because there's a huge spectrum of what is potentially what you call creative action. And I'll say that's actually my main work. I work with a group called Beautiful Trouble. I'll show you one of their books here. Mm-hmm. And what we are in the business of doing is trying to make revolution irresistible and to help upskill or serve and tool up the movements that want to actually leverage people power. And I think that's another thing to think about is when we talk about this work, we use different kinds of words. We use nonviolence, we use nonviolent action, civil resistance, people power, civil disobedience, on, without even defining them. So when I talk about nonviolent action, I'm talking about the strategic choice that people can leverage their collective agency to make change without resorting to violence. When I hear the word nonviolence, what I hear is a moral, ethical, philosophical a way of life, an underpinning that guides how you live. That is really different than a strategic choice to use nonviolent resistance or the leveraging of people power. And it really matters in this day and age because we know very few people who embrace or consider themselves fully able to embrace a nonviolence in their lifestyle or as a morality or philosophy. And that's fine because we also now, for the first time, since maybe 5 or 6 years now, have actual documentation that nonviolent resistance campaigns are twice as effective as violent campaigns. Mm-hmm. And we could talk a little bit about why that is. It's basically some numbers. When you do a nonviolent campaign, you open yourself up to greater participation. When you're doing violent campaigns, you're usually young, male, willing to pick up a gun and shoot it and hurt other people, get hurt yourselves. So when you're doing a nonviolent action campaign, everyone can participate. The ways to participate are greater. The diversity of people who feel comfortable are also increased. So the bar to participation is quite low. And then there are other reasons why it's very effective. Because it allows for more creativity, it allows for implementation and escalation of different tactics. So you're not always marching in the street if it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. You're actually doing an assessment and thinking, well, what else can we do? How can we be more innovative? How can we escalate for greater impact? And so forth. So we know a lot about how this works. And again, to talk about that synergizing nonviolent action and peace building, it's more about how we think. If we're thinking strategically, we're not just picking a random tactic and doing it over and over again, expecting different results. We're actually thinking about, well, where are we now? We have to do some education. So what do we do to encourage more people to understand what's happening? Oh, this is a spectrum of tools that we could do, whether it's a teach-in or a colorful poster or, some kind of funny thing at a grocery store. Or are we in a different place where we have a demand, we know who can give it to us, and what we need to do is actual pressure on that person to give us, or that organization to give us what we need. So, I think there's not a one-size-fits-all. We're really encouraging people to do is think strategically, that means doing an assessment. And that is a big piece of both Beautiful Trouble's work and the Synergizing Nonviolent Action. The SNAP Guide's work is to help people understand what we call methodologies or tools for doing assessment, knowing your own strengths and weaknesses as organizations, trying to make change, knowing what the threats and opportunities are externally to you so you know when you can have a great effect. And then we find, of course, and I'm partial to this, but the more creative your interventions are or your activities are, the more likely to attract media attention, the more likely you'll attract other people to join you, and the more fun you'll have. So the more likely you'll sustain your movement. And I think that's really, something to think about.
Mm-hmm. I'm sold, and that, of course, I didn't have to be sold. I've been teaching nonviolence at the university for many years. And I was a friend of Gene Sharp's for 30 years. So you didn't have to work hard to get me there, although certainly some of the tactics and tricks and stunts that you pull, I think, are just plain entertaining. And I've looked at your book, Beautiful Trouble. I think you have a new one called Beautiful Rising or something, which I haven't seen yet. Right, there you go. I have to get that one too. But I've certainly enjoyed the And then there's another book which is sort of similar by Popovich. You remind me of Popovich in that way, that he's full of all these fun things that people in Serbia did during the Otpor movement campaign and elsewhere as well. Wonderful street theater and
Well,
very
so, right, we did start off 70 artists and activists wrote this book in a cloud, and that's why I decided to do it. I was like, oh, I've never written a book in a cloud. What is that like? Together we wrote this book, and when it came out, people were really excited, and they said, don't just stop with the book. And of course, there's a website. You can purchase the books online. You can also access all the materials for free online. We feel really strongly that this work is work that needs to be made accessible so that we can all be more effective activists. And in fact, after this book, we've taken it on the road, if you will, as a training network, and we're a global training network. The second book that came, and it's online, this book is available, I think it's 7 languages, sold about 20,000 copies already. This book, this is the second book, as you said, Beautiful Rising, is focusing on stories from the global south. And this website, right now we have 2 websites. I'll say they're all merging as we speak into Beautiful Trouble. But right now, if you go online, it's Beautiful Rising. And this website is in Arabic, Spanish, Portuguese, and English. Also being translated into other languages. And the key things about this work that I would share with people is that many people tell stories of resistance, and they're fabulous, right? The key thing here with Beautiful Trouble is that we have what sort of a pattern language, a way of telling stories that lets us or helps us tease the lessons out of the stories and apply them in other circumstances. So we pull out the principles, the theories, the tactics, the methodologies that were used so that they can be used in other contexts, which is really critical, right, to spreading information about how we can be effective activists. So, for example, one of the key principles of visible. So if you're an environmental activist, for example, this is a really easy example, and you're working on climate change, or you're working on the destruction of rainforests, or you're working on the disposal of nuclear waste, all this stuff happens far away and outside of your daily frame. And so what you need to do is bring it home. You need to, and that's another principle actually, bring the problem home. But you have to make it visible to people so they understand what's happening, when you cut down the forests, when you are dealing with increase of carbon dioxide, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But there's also other things, there are simple ways that the economic system works. For example, when the banks that sort of was also invisible. So in order to make that visible, there were specific actions that took huge images of people who were made homeless by certain banks, and we pasted them on the side of the walls of the banks themselves, holding them accountable and making the problem visible to the community. Mm-hmm. And you can go on and on and on. There's many circumstantial things like this, or even, working on issues like women's rights or LGBTQ issues, making very visible the problems that are existing in the dominant culture is part of solving the problem, and often the first step. Mm-hmm. So it's better. That's really the superpower of these books. And the websites, like I said, you can go on beautifultrouble.org or beautifulrising.org and look up not only these fabulous stories, but these theories and principles about how to be more effective activists, coming from real life examples that many people have contributed to these collections.
Another person you remind me of way back would be Saul Alinsky. Do you think of that? I remember way back in Chicago, wasn't it, where he worked? And he would have people do things like, if they were protesting against a grocery store or something, they would fill their shopping baskets and just leave them. Or I was in Berkeley many, many years ago when there was some grievance against the phone company. And we had a big movement where everybody would send in their check every month to pay the phone bill with 1 cent extra, which is 1 extra pain in the butt for the people working. So now the question there was the connection in, how do you make the connection between what you're doing, why you're doing this, and the whole problem that you're protesting against? Because it seems to me you're going to need an opportunity to actually have an hour-long conversation the way we're having to get the point across about what is the issue and why it's so important.
Well, actually, so it points right back to strategic planning, where I just was ranting a minute ago, where, lots of people start with the tactic. Oh, great, we're going to fill our stuff up with our shopping carts up with stuff and leave them in the thing, or we're going to make this giant puppet and everything's going to be fine, or we're going to march and do blah, blah, blah. That's not the place where we start that determines effective outcome, right? The place we need to start is, what's our big picture vision? What are we going to do about that? How are we going to try to get there? What's our mission? What kind of resources and skills and strengths do we bring to this struggle? And who can we actually impact in a specific way that can give us what we want? Pieces of strategic planning and conflict assessment is what we call, like, doing an assessment of what's out there and why what the problem is now and why it is this way and how we got here and who is involved and what we can. It's all of those questions, right? That is one huge piece of the SNAP guide. Lisa and I actually had set out to write something pretty simple about the benefits of nonviolent action and peace building for each field. And what we realized is where they met inside and where the need was greatest is to help people be able to do more effective strategic thinking and effective strategic planning. So yeah, Saul Alinsky thought about a lot of creative things, but we try not to start there, right? That's the sexy, easy thing. That's definitely where a lot of people come in, but we try to start when people call me up and say, hey, can you get me arrested at the White House? Or, hey, can you make me a 20-foot puppet of blah, blah, blah? And I say to them, why? Because that's the strategic question that matters.
Right, exactly. But it isn't just before you do it, but also making it clear to people who are observing what you're doing.
This is what we call action logic. For example, so a good, clear example that I know you're familiar with is when you think about the lunch counter sit-ins of the civil rights struggle in the United States, where you have young Black and white students who strategically planned to occupy a lunch counter that was whites only, challenging local laws or local ways because they thought it was unjust or immoral. So sure, this was a civil disobedient action in the sense of breaking an unjust or immoral law, but it also was putting in place the future that they wanted to have. And this is another really powerful way of visualizing your actions. Like, can you actually put in place what you want? Can you build a solar-powered barn on the path of a pipeline? So not only are you blockading the pipeline, but you're actually modeling the intervention that you want. So as young Black and white students sitting at a lunch counter, they were modeling the future that they wanted, and they were also doing what we call exhibiting essentially the most perfect action logic. So does the action that you're doing make sense for the problem that you're trying to overcome? Mm-hmm. And in this way, it did in such a great way, right? We had young people doing something to show how they wanted the current situation changed for the benefit of their futures. And so these images of young Black and white students sitting at the lunch counter, completely nonviolently, dressed in their Sunday best, doing their homework, being perfect young people, and breaking a law that was unjust and immoral at the time, was presented as perfect action logic. And so, yes, it's definitely part of the planning process, the action planning process. How do you communicate what you want? If you don't have the perfect action logic, can you write a banner or a handout, leaflet? Do you have people designed to talk to people on site? How are you going to do your media? Who is doing your media? What does your social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook live feed look like? So a lot of the stuff has changed. I mean, we talk a lot about that actually. Gene Sharp, who you mentioned, was an incredible force documenting methods of nonviolent action in the 1970s. And he documented, as you know, 198 methods of nonviolent action in 3 big categories, right? And we have found that is pretty out of date, right? We've rewritten it. There's now more than 300 individually identified methodologies and in slightly different categories.
I would have thought they're by 3,000 by now.
Might be, depending upon how you clump things together. But I mean, just including some of the digital work and some of the opportunities, of course, it's, easily uh, a larger number. So, but it's really important that we think now also in sort of another context. It's not just protests, non-cooperation, and intervention. It's also thinking more about how we use both positive ways of getting change. We can call them carrots, and how we use sticks, which might be a negative way, something we won't do, or punishment. So it's a really interesting conversation to have about that. And again, we have lots of great suggestions and tools and Beautiful Trouble and Beautiful Rising for helping people think about how to be more creative and therefore more effective in your work. It all does rest on assessment and debrief and being honest with ourselves about what our strengths are and our weaknesses and how well something happened or didn't happen, when we carry it out on the ground. So, I mean, it's all part of a planning process. And, there's two big sections, right? There's the visioning and values and principles and the big campaign ideas. And then there's the small actual implementation plans. And all of that needs to be evaluated and assessment and assessed on occasion. You can't just, sometimes you get lucky and you do something and you win your campaign, but that's not typical or always expected.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I guess, I'm trying to think of where I fit into the scheme of things. And last night I had this discussion with this very sweet man who is clearly in the mode of conflict resolution, trying to find common ground with everybody. And I had to say, I get angry, and I'm not very good at that. On the other hand, I'm also not very good as a revolutionary. And I think what my role would be is in trying to understand how the pieces of various social issues fit together. And I'm a little troubled by the fact that, you mentioned the fact that nonviolent struggles and civil resistance movements have been far more effective than violent movements. And I know that you're referring to this book, How or Why Civil Resistance Works. But it's not working as well lately. And we have a number of other issues that you already alluded to, is the fact that the U.S. is, as a democracy, there's some real trouble there. Matter of fact, there's a lot of trouble in a lot of other democratic societies. So it seems to me that part of our challenge now, or a very big part of our challenge, is talking to people in a way that actually is persuasive or convincing in helping analyze what the real issues are that we face. Because if people think that the trouble that the problems in their lives are caused by immigrants and Muslims, and I don't know any Muslims or immigrants, but that's what they believe, then we've got, that's where we have to work, I think. And I'm not sure, how would you take, for example, a challenge like working with convincing Tea Party people or Trump people that they have it all put together wrong, and that our solutions are much more rational. Before you do hanging a banner from a bridge, there has to be a different kind of communication too, right? And
yeah, well, you're talking about a whole bunch of different things here.
Yeah.
So one is, people who are listening know that Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan did write this book, Why Civil Resistance Works. It's really worth the read.
The best book on this subject in the last 50 years, maybe. I think it's wonderful.
Well, the interesting thing about it is that they crunch significant numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so some of us grew up thinking, of course, nonviolent resistance is more effective because you are changing the dynamic, you're ending the cycle of violence, you're practicing something different. And in fact, they have now documentation that this is the case, that nonviolent campaigns are twice as effective as violent campaigns, as we said, that there's some kind of threshold number where if you mobilize, they found that campaigns that mobilize 3.5% of the population to be active members, none of them failed. They all succeeded in their campaigns. And others that didn't mobilize that much also succeeded. like for some of us, I grew up thinking, oh, we'll always have to convince more than half of the population, right? Because that's how change happens. But in fact, that's not true. You don't need that many people actively involved to make change happen. They also found that nonviolent movements were quite a bit larger than violent movements. As I said, it's a numbers game. I think the number was 11 times larger. And most interestingly, they found that even if campaigns failed on the first go around by their own standards, 5 or 10 years later, they were much more likely, I think 30% more likely to have succeeded in implementing democratic changes, because most likely people have been practicing, and or those institutions were then there that could support the change to these more democratic ways. So I think this is really important. And it also talks a little bit about what we need to do, for example, in the United States, if you're talking about the Tea Party or extreme right-wing fanatics. One thing is, of course, to do civic education. We have an abysmal record of doing actual civic education in the United States and many other places in the world. We're in a low period. I would say normally there's been more civic education that's happened. And that's something that could be done pretty easily. And I would consider that on the spectrum of peace building, right? But it's certainly something that nonviolent activists have done a lot of over the years as well. And I would also say that when we think about building a campaign, we don't win campaigns necessarily by moving the Reagans or the Bushes or the Trumps into our camp. We don't have unlimited resources, time, money, people, and moving that, the extreme opposition, if you will, into our camp is not a really good use of our resources if what we need to do is move 3.5% of the population to be active participants, or even if we needed to move 50%, right? Because those people are always going to be outliers. And there's a tool called the Spectrum of Allies. It's in both Beautiful Trouble and the Snap Guide that basically looks at the whole spectrum of, if you're in the peace building world, you would say stakeholders, nonviolent activists say opponents and allies. So we look at both active allies, passive allies, the middle sector, which is full of people, middle neutrals, middle positives, middle negatives, if you will, those who go on either side, and then passive opponents and active opponents. And we don't win, campaigns don't win by focusing all our energies on the most extreme active opponents. We win by moving the people in the middle just one slice over to the passive allies. We win by moving the passive allies into active allies. And that's how we get our numbers up. And that's how we get that 3.5% or even our 50%, whatever it is. And that is also good news for us because we don't have unlimited resources. So we can't win if we don't actually strategically think about where to target our time, our money, our people. And tools like this, Spectrum of Allies, and many other tools, like, the SWOT guide, the Pillars of Power, the Onion tool. There's so many in these guides that can help us focus and figure out what's going to be much more effective as activists, particularly taking, into account our limited resources and abilities. So it doesn't mean that we won't yell at these right-wing folks a lot, or we need to do that to feel good, or it doesn't mean that we won't polarize issues either. But it does mean that we should understand what we're gaining and losing when we make these choices.
Okay. Yeah, and I would have to say 100% I agree with everything you said. I'm not so sure that everything that was true 15 years ago is quite as true now, because, of course, the success rate isn't probably on the same scale as it was when Maria and Erica were doing their book. The authoritarians have learned some tricks too in the meantime.
This is true.
And certainly a lot of it has to do with managing means of communication, so that the methods that we might use to share our ideas and organize ourselves might not be as effective in certain countries where they have tools that they can use against us. Also, I'm not so sure that the 3.5% would always be true now. I mean, if I look at what's going on in Venezuela, I understand that, as I've been told, it's on the order of 85 or 90% of the population would be in favor of Guaido or whatever his name is. and against the Maduro regime, but that's
Actually,
that's a far more than 3.5%.
Venezuela is a little more complicated in the sense that we have the person in charge, Maduro, is acting abhorrently towards the population. He's doing terrible things. The people are suffering. So there's no defense of Maduro's policies or Maduro himself. On the other hand, we have U.S. intervention and Guaido being put in place via U.S. intervention along with some support in Venezuela, but it's not clear. The two things that you said, people can be against both Maduro and Guaido. And I think that that's really important to know, that the Venezuelan people are not actually in full control right now of their own destiny because of intervention by the U.S. and other foreign forces. So it's a very complicated thing to talk about. The one thing that I will say is that we all say that we believe in the right of people, the sovereign right of people to govern themselves. And intervention is from the outside actually violates that. And so, that's definitely something to think about. And yes, I'm sure.
Well, yes. Now, there's a whole thing. I had a bit of a conversation with Maciej Bartkowski a few months ago when he and I did a talk show like this. And one of the things that I wanted to raise with him was, to what extent do we have the right to support people in other countries who are not really free to resist their own government regime and not really in a very good position to gain their rights? I myself have always tended to want to support, and I even want my government to support, and I have two governments. I have Canada and the US. I want both of them to support people in other countries who don't have an opportunity to defend their rights. So the question is, what methods can we say are legitimate for people outside the country to use in support of beleaguered people in another country?
Well, I think for me, it's pretty easy. I don't think that military intervention is ever warranted. That's just me personally.
I would agree with 100% on that. Now, what about sanctions?
So, and then the other thing I would say, again, it's really a strategic question. And one of the things that I believe very strongly is in the power of training and education. Obviously, through both Beautiful Trouble, through the SNAP work that I do, it's about helping people understand that there are tools, resources, information out there that can be useful to them. They can take this information and see if it works in their own context. Me imposing answers from my personal context, which is in the United States, as a woman in the United States, doesn't make much sense. I'm happy to share the tools and the assessment techniques and the training skills that I use in campaigns that I am personally involved in. I insist when I do work that people take these things and make sure that they work for their own context. And I think that that's our key thing. So if you're doing basically a nonviolent coup in a country, that's not okay, right? This is not an external force should not be supporting that. I think that it's important to support people in being able to have agency over their own lives. And it's very particular to circumstance, right? So I do know some Venezuelans who are really happy with Trump now because he's taking a hardline stance against Maduro. But I know Venezuelans who are really against any U.S. intervention because they know that they have no control over what the U.S. will do once it's actually integrated itself somehow into the next government, if that happens. Mm-hmm. And so I don't feel like I have to be trapped by an easy black or white answer on this. These are complicated situations. I think we do need to take the leadership from the Venezuelans on the ground and help people exercise their people power, their own agency in their own context with some basic underlying principles of equality and justice and non-oppression and things like that. So, I personally don't work with people who I consider have oppressive policies, whether they're racist, sexist, homophobic, ageist, you name it. I mean, these are not, and I think when I counsel people, whether it's nationally or internationally, and they are not feminist, for example, in their analysis, I can pretty clearly say to them, you will likely fail in your campaign because the principles that underlie your work are going to limit participation in your movement, and eventually people are going to turn against you. And I think that that's a really important thing to think about. And where some of this basic dialogue and talking to people that you don't agree with come in, the capacity to do that come into play. The ability to communicate well with people who are not in your inner circle matters, so that you can expand your group. And then eventually to figure out, who are your unlikely bedfellows? Who are the allies in particular circumstances? And what are you willing to negotiate to build your people power nonviolently? And what are non-negotiable principles or values that you hold on the way to achieving some of your gains? And I think that these things are not simple. And I think that, part of the issue with the current day social media craze and the short-term attention span leads us to try to make simple decisions all the time, when in fact there's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of need to be able to hold that ambiguity to figure out the next path.
Okay, if people can be free enough to actually use the tools and the tips that you give them, hooray, because they were lucky. Because if you're a Rohingya right now, or if you're a Uyghur in Eastern China, Western China, you are not in a very good position to do the kinds of stunts that might, you think, give power. I think the problem is there are situations where people are helpless, really helpless, to get their own freedom, and that some kind of external help is needed. I don't, that's where I'm hung up. I'm not quite sure.
It's not that simple. So like, for example, it's one of the basic, there's some basic stories that we could look at, like the repression of Pinochet in Chile, right? I mean, and this is one of the positive things from Maria and Erica's book, is that they looked at, I don't know, almost 400 cases of violent and nonviolent campaigns over 100 plus years, right? And it was the determination of whether or not people won was not how brutal the regime was. Like, it wasn't that you had a less brutal regime so you could win. It was really about the skills and abilities and strategic planning of the groups that were engaged in the resistance movement. And so, like, Chile is a great example. There's a story about the Chilean copper workers who were going to march out of the mines to protest Pinochet's regime. And the copper mines, as you might know, were the economic backbone of the country. And Pinochet was like, well, we'll just shoot each one of you as you walk out of the mines. So they were faced with this dilemma. What do we do? And smartly, they said, it's not really worth we believe them that they will shoot us as we walk out of these mines. And so we're not going to do that now. We're going to wait and live another day. And instead they turned to a bunch of dispersed activities. Rather than this concentrated walking out of the mine and getting shot, they dispersed their activities to continue to build up the resistance movement. They did things like cacerolazas. They had people at night in their kitchens banging pots and pans at 9 o'clock. And the regime was like, well, do we arrest everybody in their kitchens? Are they just cooking dinner? What do we know? How do we know what's going on? And it's so dispersed, it's really difficult. They did slowdowns, or people would be walking in the center of town and they'd be just going very, very slowly. Do you arrest everybody who's walking slowly? Maybe they're just hot. Maybe they're tired. Or what's happening? And this way, and even today, there's lots of stories about how resistance movements have used dispersed, more creative techniques to signal that there's still a resistance movement, to build up the capacity to develop support for real risk-taking. Again, this is also something I talk about right away. Number one, there's nothing passive about this work. Like, people use that word all the time. I think it's a confusion with pacifism, which is, of course, the belief that war is wrong rather than passive, not doing anything. This is all very intentional, whether you're just lying down in the road blocking something or sitting down. It's an intentional, active form of resistance, and there's nothing guaranteed about it. There's nothing safe about it. In fact, it's really a way for courageous people, as has been noted by many famous people. There's no guarantee that there will be non-injury or no violence on the part of the regimes that you're dealing with or the authorities that you're dealing with. In fact, we do know that there will be risks, that people take real risks of death and destruction. And so we do also know that this will and tends to limit the repression that happens. It tends to lower the numbers of people who are negatively impacted. And when repression is severe enough, it mobilizes sentiment in favor of the resisting groups and against those who are putting the repression in place. It's another feedback loop that actually supports nonviolent actors against the regimes that they're protesting. So it's really a matter of where you are on your trajectory, what kind of judgments you have about your opposition, what kind of tactics and tools they're going to use, and trying to be, for lack of a better word, smart or strategic, to think about what your options are at different times and to try and use tactics and tools that are appropriate for the moment that you're in your campaign or your movement.
I absolutely, completely, totally agree with you about the desirability and the value and the frequent success of people power against authoritarian regimes. And I don't think it's 100%, and I don't think the odds have been favorable lately. And I sort of think, in addition to supporting, to giving permission or giving our sending our love and good wishes to people who are undergoing these struggles themselves, that there is some kind of need oftentimes to actually help them. Mm-hmm. And I have real questions in my own mind about how far one can go appropriately in helping people in such situations. I mean, if, I guess where I came upon this most was when I was spending a lot of time in Russia and finding that most of my friends were totally passive about resisting Putin or any of the other previous dictators. Brezhnev, I started going when Brezhnev was around. They wanted to be independent. A lot of people would come to me and clearly were favorable to democracy, sneak around and talk to me as if we're really good buddies, and so on. But they didn't do anything. And when I've talked to them since, mostly say, well, if we actually manage to get rid of one of our dictators, whichever one that we have today, the general population would just want another one, and the next guy would be just as bad. So I've, I don't know how far. I mean, I helped what I could when I was helping dissidents back, in the Cold War days. I did what I could because I believe that one should stand up for people who are deprived of their rights. And now I'm really unclear about how far one can go. Maybe as individuals, maybe whether or not how far a government can go in supporting the rights of an oppressed group. How far could Canada go in helping the Rohingya or the Uyghurs now, or the women in Saudi Arabia, or the Yemeni people? And so,
certainly, there are definitely things that the governments can do that they're not doing, right? There's a whole spectrum of things that governments can do that we can't. They can levy tariffs. They can kick people out of, institutional formats. They can institute governmental boycotts. They could stop selling arms. They could put fines and penalties and actually punish corporations that they have control over if they do sell arms or other or gas, tear gas or whatever things. There's plenty of things that our governments, both the U.S. government and Canadian government, are not doing.
Mm-hmm.
They are not actually fulfilling their humanitarian responsibilities, I would say. So that's something really critical, really important to focus on. There are a whole spectrum of activities that governments can do that don't include sending arms, that don't include, intervening militarily, that don't include, staging a coup in another country. But there's plenty of other things that the governments can do and that are accepted universally as appropriate government techniques for helping to enforce or secure human rights and to end human rights violations and oppressive techniques. And so I think that there's plenty of that. And there's plenty of person-to-person things that can happen as well. Organizational communities, community-to-community sister city projects. There's plenty of neighbor-to-neighbor kind of things that can also happen, whether it's simple as supporting people by sending money, or like another Chile example is, the case of the arperistas, the women who made these beautiful tapestries and were able to sell them to get money to fuel resistance movements, or at least to feed their families. I mean, when you are embracing a spectrum of creative actions, I would say you're only limited by your intellectual and creative curiosity and figuring out what options are for supporting others and making sure that people enjoy the highest level of human rights and environmental protections possible. So, I mean, I think that's really important. And I think, the fall of the Soviet Union is a really fascinating case. And I would just come back from Lithuania, actually, and the Latvian, in the states that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania that managed to withdraw from the Soviet Union when there was just a crack of glasnost. And I think, the hubris of the Soviets thinking that they would just, of course, want to stay part of the Soviet Union is, of course, a contributing factor, but it's not the only factor, right? So you had a massive outpouring of nonviolent resistance. You had millions of people doing things like holding hands across the region. You had people in Estonia singing, another great story of the singing revolution. I mean, there's just an endless number of things that could happen and could be used if we can understand basic principles of effective resistance. And in maintaining nonviolent discipline is certainly one of the keys to this work. Building unity and solidarity, ever increasing our numbers in people power, and then of course taking the time to plan and escalate and be innovative is also key factors. And it allows us, if you're planning, then you can train people, which also supports maintaining nonviolent discipline in your actions. And so these things are, I mean, I'm not saying them like they're easy things to do, but they're certainly attainable things to do. And we have examples now of the people in Nicaragua for the first time really embracing nonviolent people power in the face of a history that's full of violent resistance and violent repression. So, there's, yes, the times they may be a little darker now than they have been recently with this expansion of global right-wing populism. And but I don't think these times also then are opportunities for the best of people to come out and have engendered amazing resistance movements over the past few years. So I don't think we really have a choice from my perspective. You can sit down and do nothing, and we know that things will get worse as far as ordinary people go, or we can try to embrace some of these tools that we have at our disposal and some of the learning that we have so far, and distill the learning that we get as we march forward on this path of nonviolent resistance and people power. So that's clearly what I advocate.
Absolutely, and I'm totally wowed. You really are an inspiration. I mean, this is your energy and your ability to focus on not only abstractions, but clearly how to get there. I really think that's an extremely important thing, even if I've tried to give you a little trouble along the way. In some of the troubles in my own mind about how to resolve some of these issues. Tell me a little bit about where you're going with this now. You talk about a merger of this Beautiful Trouble and Beautiful Rising. What is this kind of an organization emerging, or what are you up to?
So Beautiful Trouble is the organization. We happen to have 2 books and 2 websites, Beautiful Trouble and Beautiful Rising. But to make it easier and more accessible for people, it will all be accessible under the Beautiful Trouble frame, probably in the fall. But the books will still be available, and all of the information will still be online. We also, like we said, we're in the business of trying to make sure people are more effective activists, make sure revolution is more irresistible. We have you can always donate to that. You can always buy books and support us. You can always call us for a training in your community or a workshop of some kind. Just look at the website, beautifultrouble.org.
Do you do that yourself? You go out and train people?
I do. And we have a network of people globally who do that. They're all really phenomenal facilitators.
Where besides North America?
Name a place.
Oh,
we don't have everyone. We don't have places. We don't have someone in every country, but we have people all over the world, and we're constantly working with other folks and training people. And there's a lot of networks that we liaise with. So it's not just us, obviously, who are doing this work. We're developing a card deck that will help people harness some of these principles and tactics in a fun way to do better planning and action development. We have a guide.
Well, let me get it. Where do I get a card deck?
You'll have a chance to purchase one through a GoFundMe page that we're about to launch any minute.
Oh. But be sure you put me on your mailing list, because I want to buy what is it, like a deck of cards or something you said?
It's a formal deck of cards with games that will help you be more strategic and effective as activists.
Uh-huh.
And also, like, if you're looking for more information too, the SNAP guide and the SNAP project, the Synergizing Nonviolent Action and Peacebuilding Project out of the USIP, that materials, there'll be videos and facilitator materials in addition to the book available for free online. So it's about, making this stuff more accessible to make us all more effective with the limited resources that we have, so that we can have a, more healthy, equitable, peaceful place to live. And
you're connected with the USIP, and that to me is very interesting, because the USIP is funded by the US government.
Yeah, it's a semi-governmental group. And in fact, that's just me. That's not, Beautiful Trouble is not actually connected to USIP.
Yes, but I know you are, and I know that Shazka is. Is Lisa Shirk also connected?
Well, she and I both wrote the SNAP guide together.
Yeah, okay.
So
I took a course there once. It's a gorgeous building. I remember thinking, it felt kind of empty. There was nobody there, but I thought, this is really an interesting thing I want to find out more about, whether or not the U.S. government could actually be funding a subversive kind of activity.
Well, you might know that it's only a semi-governmental agency, right? So it's not a full governmental agency, which is both a plus and a minus for them as far as funding goes, I guess. Maria Stefan is now there's the director of a department on nonviolent resistance. So that is part of the reason why this good work can happen. And it is really focused on international partners. So they work with their own priority campaigns, their own priority agencies. And things.
Well, okay, do they do things to help the people that I've expressed concern about? Is there anybody working in a place like USIP trying to help people in repressed countries?
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right.
That's why this exists.
Mm-hmm.
It's to help people be smarter activists that they work in, taking what is appropriate for their context and using it in the right in the format that makes sense for them. Again, I'm not in a position to tell people what to do. I don't think that's an okay thing.
Yeah. All right. I get it. Okay. So, what is your next role? What are you doing mostly now?
I am heavily involved in training and education and facilitation around nonviolent resistance, both locally and nationally and internationally. So that's where I'll continue to do that work and to help people be more effective at creating a future that serves more of us in a healthier way.
Great. Well, we've done it. We've had our get acquainted conversation, and I hope this is the first of several. It's been very pleasant. Thank you very much, and I give you every good wish for all your wonderful work. Okay? Bye.
Yeah.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.